So, good evening, everyone, and it's nice to be chatting to a few of you before we got started, so that's great. So, I wanted to talk tonight about retrospectives because retrospectives seem to me to be perhaps one of the most important of the Scrum ceremonies, and yet it's one that, if you look at time after time, it's when the basically what happens is that the coach or the Scrum Master really struggles with it, and you get comments like, we're trying to make it more interesting, or it's more boring, or well, I play games. I heard somebody say I play my guitar in the retrospective, and there's lots of stuff going on. So I thought it would be good to have a purposeful look at retrospectives because of its importance in terms of team efficiency. So if I just remind you, I'm Jon Ward. I've been involved in Agile coaching since 2007. I'm a disciplined Agile Senior Scrum Master. I'm a SAFe SBC certified Scrum Master and an IC Agile Coach certified. I belong to the Cutter panel of Agile experts, and that's a group of about 25 or 30 Agile experts around the world that are providing consultancy and thought leadership to the Cutter Consortium. I'm also a member of the Agile Business Consortium and the Agile Alliance, and I've got a book in publication. In fact, I signed off the proof this morning, called the Agile Coaches Cookbook, which contains some of this wisdom, but has got a lot of other materials in it. I'm currently leading an Agile transformation in a major telecoms provider. I've got 5,000 people in my scope, and we're doing software engineering Agile, and we're doing non-software engineering Agile. So there's quite a lot of business Agile projects that we're running and so on. So it's kind of interesting because there's lots of things going on, and it's really, I'm really loving it, and I'm enjoying working with these guys in the telecoms company. So I thought we'd start by having a look at the Scrum Guide, because I think that quite a lot of people assume what the retrospective is about. And I think what's happened with the retrospective is that over the course of the years, people have forgotten what the intent was of the Scrum Guide, and basically lost touch with some of its purposes and so on. Basically, the Scrum Guide 2020 says the purpose of the retrospective is to plan ways to increase quality and effectiveness. So if you think about your last retrospective, did it increase quality and did it increase the team effectiveness? Because if it didn't, then we're missing the purpose of the Sprint Retrospective. So we need to try and think about, okay, how does it work and so on. So when we're talking about how it works, the Scrum team basically discusses what went well during the sprint, what problems it encountered, and how those problems were or were not solved. That's again a quote from the Scrum Guide 2020. Okay, so how those questions relate to quality and effectiveness, I think, is a bit of a challenge. So we might want to think about that in a minute. So let's look at team effectiveness for a minute. Okay, so we've got a Scrum Master with a team, and it could be the Scrum Master that runs the retrospective. I've got a male and a female Scrum Master there, so I don't offend anybody. But on the other hand, it could be a coach as well, looking at how that Scrum Master is working with the team. So sometimes quite often I get asked if you could come and facilitate a retrospective because the Scrum Master actually wants to participate. So the Scrum Master, according to the Scrum Guide, is accountable for the Scrum team's effectiveness. And they do this by enabling the Scrum team to improve its practices within the Scrum framework. I find that kind of interesting because if you actually dig into what practices are in the Scrum framework, there's virtually nothing. There's nothing. It's everything about the product and how the product is produced, but it doesn't tell you about how to develop that product. And it says quite specifically that it's down to the team to decide? Well, I'm struggling with, I've got novice teams, I've got people come off Scrum training, Scrum Masters, recently certified. I've got product owners coming off training, recently certified. And what I find is that when I go and visit that team, I find that they're not using any agile working practices at all. In fact, 9 times out of 10, they're still working in the same way as they did with a traditional or waterfall project, and they're still working with the same practices. And what you've effectively got is a waterfall siloed team working inside a Scrum framework. And so there's nothing in there that helps the team improve its practices. So I really sort of want to try and think about, okay, if the retrospective is to improve quality and effectiveness, and the Scrum framework doesn't have any practices, we've got to get those practices from somewhere, because otherwise, I mean, how does a team learn about BDD or test-driven requirements or continuous testing or peer programming or pair programming rather? How does a team do that? All the XP stuff, how do they do that? So if you look at the Scrum, okay, the Scrum framework, it says it's purposely incomplete and only defines the parts that are required to implement Scrum theory. So it's no wonder that if we send the team off and say they've had Scrum training, when they come back, they're not able to actually produce a product. They still need more data, more details, more ways of working. It does say that the Scrum is built upon the collective intelligence of people using it. So what we're saying is that the Scrum team can start to decide what they're going to do once they understand what's available to them. So I think the retrospective is a point where we could actually start to help the Scrum team from thinking about how they want to work and how they need to work. Rather than providing people with detailed instructions, it says that the rules of the Scrum guide their relationships and interactions. Actually, it's kind of interesting because there is nothing in that Scrum Guide which says anything about learning together. There's nothing in that Scrum Guide which says anything about, there's some stuff about values, some openness and trust and things like this. But actually, in terms of detailed about the relationship, and particularly the working relationship, there's nothing about roles and responsibilities other than product owner and Scrum Master and team member. And so there's a whole load of, I'll call it stuff for want of a better term. There's a whole load of things that the team needs to get to in order to actually start to work as an effective team. I've found a very interesting book by a guy called, and I don't know whether it's a man or a woman, Grattan. The future, it's called The Shift. The future of work is already here. And basically what he says is collections of people with diverse perspectives and ways of seeing the world can rapidly outperform collections of people who rely on a single perspective. Now, I'm starting to form the opinion that Scrum is, we train the people in Scrum and that framework, they get a single perspective of the world. And I think that means that they are all thinking in the same way. So nobody's breaking the pattern, nobody's breaking the mold. So that means that the team is not becoming as effective as it could be. I had a conversation with a coach yesterday, and he said to me, I've been really struggling with getting the team to think about how they can improve their performance. He said after 2 or 3 sprints, they've understood or they've got to the basics of Scrum, but what we find is that their productivity or their output or the value they create plateaus very rapidly. So what we've got to think about, I think, is how do we apply the retrospective so that we do start to think about effectiveness and quality. So the first thing I'm going to say to you is let's change the questions. If you remember what the Scrum Guide said, it had 3 questions. What went well? What problems were encountered? And what problems were or were not fixed, or how were the problems solved? Okay. In practice, what a lot of Scrum Masters do is they actually short circuit those questions. So we still say what went well. I've seen lots of post-its stuck up on the wall saying what went less well. Okay, and I'm seeing lots of things. What do we want to change? But you know, the context of those questions to me seem to limit the team exploring options that are around the purpose of the retrospective. So I'm suggesting, and we've got some people on the call who I hope are on the call by now, who actually have changed the questions. So I'm suggesting we change the questions. The first thing is, how do we increase our quality? Go back to that statement in the Scrum Guide. It's about quality and effectiveness. So how do we increase our quality? What this means that we're going to need some data. What is our current, escape defects numbers? Maybe there's something there that we might want to tackle. What's the current level of bug fixing we're hitting in production? What's the current level of bugs that we're getting when we start to do our automated testing and so on? So how do we increase our quality would help the team start to think more about the purpose of the retrospective than what went well. The next question is, how can we be more effective? Now, the interesting thing about how can we be more effective is it could open conversations about interpersonal relationships. It could open conversations around process. It could open conversations around tooling. It could open conversations around impediments or systemic blockers or whatever. So how can we be more effective is a very powerful question, open question, which would have the team starting to think more about what they could or could not do. The last question is, which options should we select? Well, you say, John, well, we haven't started to talk about our options yet. So if you get, how do we increase our quality? You can see the team might brainstorm some ideas out. How can we be more effective? You could get the team to brainstorm some ideas out. To get the team really thinking out the box, sometimes you have to go to the absurd extreme. So if they said, okay, can you picture the absolute utopian situation with improving our quality? What would that be? So they come up with this dream picture, and then you might say, okay, well, how can we modify that back to reality, to something we could actually do? So in this way, what we're doing is we're getting some options on the table about quality and effectiveness, and then we're starting to say, okay, which option shall we select? Okay, so now we've got a direct link between the questions and the purpose of the retrospective. So what was interesting, I've been looking at, there's a lovely lady called Jutta Eckstein, and she's written a book that's on Lean Publishing called Retrospectives for Organizational Change. And she's talked about the 5 phases for the retrospective. Can somebody go on mute, please? Okay, that first stage is about setting the stage, okay? And this is about the work. This is about getting people to say, look, this is a meeting to look at effectiveness and quality. And so saying that all ideas are open. We're not going to be criticizing individual. And this allows the team to get into the physical and mental state so that they can actually start to contribute. The next thing is that, and I think this is a lot of the problem that we get with retrospectives, is we don't present the team with the data. And I'm a firm believer of the Scrum Alliance has just issued a paper called Evidence-Based Management, but it's not really what was talked about evidence-based management in 2018. So I think we need to go back to the basics, but the basics of evidence-based management is present the data and explain the options. So if you collect the data, then you can present it. So for example, you might want to present to the team what their current cycle time is, or their cycle time trend. That comes straight out of Jira. Most teams use Jira. You might want to get them to look at their defects. You might want to look at the commit to achieve ratio in terms of their estimating and commitments and their sprint planning and so on. So this would give the team data to start to do some analysis around how they can improve their quality and their effectiveness. So the next thing is to get the team to analyze the data and look for themes, patterns, and puzzles. I love that term, themes, patterns, and puzzles. Now, generating those insights, so what I talked about was selecting the options or creating the options or identifying how they may be able to change. So this process gives us a nice structure for thinking through. So if we're coaching a retrospective, then we can start to think about setting the stage. Oh, I need some data. Where are the data? Can I get that from? Where is the data? How do I get the data out of the tools? How do I present it in a way that the team can understand? So there's some preparation around this. You can understand generating insights. You might create a mural or a whiteboard or an area where the team can put post-its up and vote and use all of those techniques in order to generate their insights, and then they can decide what to do. So if the team decides what they wish to work on, then the team is committed to doing that and working on that. I've said there as well which experiments they want to run. So I think I might have said this in a previous webinar, but somebody told me a few months back that if your team is doing today the same as what it was doing 3 months ago, it's not continuously improving. So if you think of the agile principles around lean and continuous improvement, if we're doing the same thing as we did last time, as we did the time before, then we can expect not to improve. And I think it's Einstein that said, doing the same thing repetitively and expecting a different result is the first sign of insanity. And I think with the retrospectives, I think that some of us are acting on the edge of what Einstein was talking about. So the fifth point is to close the retro. Okay, and I think this is a real important step, because having got the team to go through this process, if we close the retro and say, right, that's it, and do nothing with it, then all that insight that was generated at the third step has been lost. So what I think we need to do is to look at creating creating a backlog with the outcomes or the insights, looking at the improvement backlog, but most importantly, to decide how to measure the results. Because if we're thinking about improving the quality, there's a metric there somewhere we can use. Is it going to be reducing the defects, increasing the quality, increasing the speed of testing, or whatever? If we think about effectiveness, maybe we might say we want to reduce cycle time. We might say we might want to increase the speed with which we deliver value. There could be a lot of things there. So I think a fundamental part of having a retro is to get a measured outcome. So if we're thinking about games, or if we're thinking about using walks on the beach to create a retrospective because it's interesting and fun, if we didn't get a measured outcome, then we've probably not done the best service that we could to that team, because we're not helping that team improve the effectiveness. Okay, so I think fundamentally we need to have measured outcomes as a result of a retrospective. The OKR principle. And I think it's Deming or Drucker that said, you don't get what you don't measure. I'm paraphrasing, but basically I think what we've got to start to think about is we really want to get, if we're really serious about continuous improvement, if we're really serious about increasing the team's effectiveness, reducing the incidence of plateauing, we've got to really get to grips with this retrospective process. And I don't think the Scrum Guide helps us at all, or as much as it could do. But I think somebody like Jetta Eckstein is really starting to think about how we can get better retrospectives for our teams. It's a fundamental part of the Deming cycle: plan, do, study, adjust. You can see in here, generating the insights, gathering the data are elements around the studying. Deciding what to do is around the adjust. Okay, so these phases of the retrospective are really, I think, very important, and I think we need to dig in. So this is the reminder. we are looking for measurable improvements from a retrospective. It's not, okay, you might have some interpersonal issues bubbling along, you might have some soft stuff, but in the main, when we're talking about coaching, the impact of the coach, there's a very interesting paper, oh gosh, I can't remember the lady's name. There's a very interesting paper which says that they measured the coaching impact of doing interpersonal skills coaching, and they rated that as a 1. But if you're doing process consulting or process coaching with a team, the impact is up at around a 7. So it's 7 times more impactful than doing the interpersonal skills stuff. And I think some of the IC Agile stuff and things like that are all focused on the interpersonal skills. And I think we tend to forget some of the process pieces. But if you go back to that Scrum guide, it's the Scrum Master that is responsible for encouraging the team to define their processes. If you go back to the Scrum Guide, it is the team that is responsible for effective delivery of solutions. So what we're saying is we need to start to think about this through a different lens than perhaps we have been thinking about before. So the other thing which I'm kind of interested about is the timing of the retrospective. According to the Scrum Guide, we go through backlog preparation, refinement, we go into sprint planning, we get to sprint backlog, and we go into estimation and so on. The sprint runs, we have a daily scrum, and we create a potentially shippable product. With that potentially shippable product, we do a sprint review. But the Scrum Guide is very specific. The last thing on the sprint is the retrospective. So if you look at the timing of that retrospective, it's at the end. It's the very last thing. So 3-week sprint, you're going to do that on day 5 of week 3, according to the Scrum Guide, right? Now, I'd like you to think about timing a little bit. And I know I've got some South African friends on here, and I've got no qualms whatsoever in showing this. It's the Rugby World Cup final 1995, and if anybody has seen the film Invictus, you know how important this event was in the birth of the new South Africa. And so these guys have not only just received the cup from Nelson Mandela, they've got all this euphoria, the whole nation united. Excuse me. The whole nation united in the formation of this, in this achievement. Now, if you think about, this is an extreme example, but would that team now, after just winning a World Cup, be in a position where it can reflect and decide on what it needs to change for the next World Cup? No, they'll want to party, they'll want to celebrate, they'll want to remind their families what's happened, all of that sort of stuff. If you think about the team that they beat, in this instance, it was the New Zealand All Blacks. But if you think about any team that's just lost a major championship, are they in a position where they are going to want to reflect and start to learn and think about ways of doing it next time? No, they're emotionally drained, they're emotionally spent, they need to rebuild themselves inside. So if you think about our Scrum teams in a lesser degree, but still to an extent, they've just got to the end of the sprint, they've gone into a sprint review, they've received a load of negative feedback. Are they in a position where they really want to reflect? Possibly not. If you think about, they go into the sprint review, they get loads of praise, they've got celebrations, they've got their backlog, they've got their things that they want to do. They don't want to reflect, they want to move on. So what they're saying is, what I'm saying to you is, having that timing of the retrospective at the end of the sprint from a human psychological perspective doesn't make a lot of sense. Okay, so there's a piece of work which has been done by a lady by the name of Connie Gersick, and Connie wrote a paper in 1988 called Time and Transition in Work Teams. and it was about a new model for group development. And I'm reading it in a book by Richard Horsted, I think his name is, called Team Performance. And what Connie is saying is, if you think about the way a team works, the first thing they do is they start to explore the task. They understand the scope. They start to want to understand what they're going to do. They might just start to explore alternative ways of working. I have in my mind, I've got a case study or an exercise I do in training where they build a tower with Jenga blocks, and they have to get the highest tower competing against teams and stick a post-it note on the top of the tower. And I always see these teams playing with this task and looking at different ways of getting the Jenga blocks together, and they start to work out what their alternatives are and so on. The next step is that the team agree a framework. They agree a way of working together. They decide how they're going to achieve their task, right? And I can see this with the Jenga blocks. They've experimented. They've got that tower. They realize that they're going to beat the guys on the right and the ladies on the left, and they then start to build their tower according to the way that they've agreed, right? But the next point is that there is a midpoint transition. Now, what Connie's done is she studied these 12 or so teams in order to come up with this thesis for the University of California. But what she found was interesting is it didn't matter if the teams were a team of doctors or a team of engineers or a team of artists or a team of, I think she had a team of lawyers as well. Not software engineers, sadly, but at the midpoint, all of the teams virtually at the same instant, the teams all decided, let's hang on, we're not going to get there. So the deadline means that we've got to change the way we're working. Because what happens is in that step 2, they've worked on a way of working, but they've forgotten what the deadline is, and they might have over-egged the process. You know, we all talk about gold plating the process. They may have done that. They may have more content than they were expecting. So at the midpoint, they then say, based on the deadline, we're not going to get there, or we need to change the way of working, or we're in a position, I'm going to say this now, we're in a position where we want to learn. So this means that this midpoint is an opportunity where against the end of the sprint, where the team may be not psychologically in a good place to start to learn, reflect and improve, it looks that the midpoint is a great place to start to learn. Okay, the 5th piece is that they're completing, and then the team focuses on completing the task, and so on. But if you go back to that step 3, that midpoint transition, and go to the sport again, and how many times have you heard a sports commentator say, well, that was a game of 2 halves. We don't know what the coach did at half time, but he changed the whole face of the game. If you think of let's play American football for a minute, or a lot of the American games, they do timeouts, and in the middle of the game they take a timeout and they do some coaching. So it looks to me as though we might be in a better situation psychologically to look at moving the retrospective into the middle of the sprint rather than at the end of the sprint. So that would mean to ask the question, instead of saying, how did it go? The coach would be asking the question, how is it going? And then we could start to think about maybe making some corrections so that they actually get to the sprint goal at the end of the sprint, instead of getting to the end of the sprint and realizing that they've missed the goal. So this seems to me to be a better way of thinking about retrospectives and thinking about the timing. Okay, so I asked 2 or 3 people to experiment with this. One of the guys, unfortunately, his wife has gone into labor, so he's not going to be able to feed back. But is Steve Limmer on the call? No. Is Joanne Turney on the call? you want to unmute.
Oh yeah. Hi, John.
Hey, hello.
How are
Do you want to introduce yourself and tell us what was the result of your experiment, please?
Yeah, absolutely. My name's Joanne Tierney. We met on a webinar not long ago, and you kindly asked me to be a guinea pig, in which I kindly accepted to use your way of thinking, a different way of thinking, agile way of thinking, and introduced it to the team midway through a sprint to have a retro. We did that. It was successful, as all retros that we have done. They're always different. I like to spice them up. And from that, it wasn't that they wanted to continue with the retro in mid, but to bring forward the refined product backlog as a most definite part of the sprint, which was brilliant. So we've now got a set midway refined backlog, and see where we're at and where we can improve the quality in the process and the efficiency. So yeah, thank you very much for that.
Okay, and do you think that you can continue with running the retro in the middle of the sprint?
I don't know whether for this team it would work, okay, but it doesn't mean it won't work for another. So I'm more than happy to try it when I get the chance from the team.
Okay, why do you think not for this team?
Because the team made that decision, and if they were very much against it, but we gained from it, we gained that we need a backlog refinement mid-sprint. We've got too many meetings, I think it comes down to.
Okay, all right, thank you very much. Anything else you want to add?
Oh, no, thank you for asking me to.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Okay, thanks, Joanne.
No problem.
Is Steve on the call? No. Okay, let me summarize what Steve did. Steve went to his Scrum Masters, and he had 3 Scrum Masters that he's coaching, and he went to the Scrum Masters and suggested they move the retrospective into the middle of the sprint. The Scrum Masters point blankly refused. Now, I find that really interesting, because what basically those Scrum Masters are saying is that they want to adhere to a framework which is purposefully incomplete, over the fact that there may be an opportunity for them to explore ways to increase their effectiveness and efficiency. So I think what Steve's example proves is that some people feel that they've got to religiously follow the Scrum principles and miss the fact that they are other parts of Agile are suggesting continuous improvement and improving working methods and so on. Even the Scrum Guide says the purpose is to increase effectiveness and quality, right? So I think that the Scrum Guide it says it's specifically incomplete. Okay. If you take something away from the Scrum, then you're not doing Scrum. But Scrum is designed to add things into it. So the fact of moving the timing from the endpoint to the midpoint is an experiment, but it still means you're still doing Scrum, but you're just asking slightly different questions. So I think that you can be fairly relaxed about doing that. I don't think anybody would challenge you to that you're not doing Scrum, and indeed, if they feel you're not doing Scrum, then fair enough. If it's improved the effectiveness of your team and it's improves the quality of the delivery of your team, then why not? So that's what I think. That's the sort of the logic behind trying to think about the way in which we are encouraging the team to improve and trying to avoid plateauing. Anybody got any observations, questions, comments, thoughts? So I'd like you lot to be quiet.
Well, what's interesting to me, Jon, is the resistance to change that you outlined, and that I'm sorry, I've lost her name, the woman who ran the experiment with her team.
Joanne.
Joanne, yes, thank you. That was a wonderful, wonderful real life examples, and that resistance is always very interesting in a coaching situation, and it really comes down to sort of an anti-pattern that you would coach in other ways, right? Just the resistance to change. So yeah, I think it might reveal other mindset questions that might be explored with that same team if they were resistant to an experiment.
I agree. And I think I've been doing some work with a gentleman by the name of Al Shalloway, and Al Shalloway is the author of Flex and is now a thought leader in the PMI. And Al says the reason why we get some of the resistance is because some of our Agile practitioners don't understand the theory. So they don't understand the theory about what they're doing. They're doing Agile rather than being Agile, you know. And I think this is a classic example of people forgetting that the purpose of the retrospective is to improve effectiveness and quality. And they're relying on the fact that they're asking the set questions in the Scrum Guide to get that end result, and it doesn't happen. Anybody else? Okay. So what I've got is the next slide is actually to say to you, well, okay, how do we know what sort of questions we should ask? How do we know what type of team we should have? Now, if you've got the GROW model last time I talked about the GROW model, then the GROW model says, okay, to a team, you're saying to the team, what type of team do you want to be? Do you want to be a defect-free team? Do you want to be an inventive team? Whatever, okay. But there is something called the Agile Fluency model. Now, this is not a maturity model, although there are some maturity stages in here, but it's not a maturity model. What the Agile Fluency model gives you are the team practices that you would have at the four different levels. Okay, so basically the first shift is around Agile culture and mindset. The next is around the team skills, and then when we're starting to move into the optimizing area, they're talking about changing the organizational structure and changing the culture, right? But the model goes on to talk about, at the focusing stage, we're talking about the Agile Fundamentals. So what we would see is the team starting to adopt Agile practices. They might start to use Scrum. You might be training them. You could be coaching them. You could be setting out ways of working. They could be agreeing on that. And basically what the Fluency model says is that's typically going to take a coach between 2 and 6 months to get that team understanding and doing those fundamentals as if they are, as if it's second nature. The next one was around, they called it delivering, and this is about the responsiveness. So how does a team take work in? It's about the demand management process. It's also about how the work gets delivered into production or out from the team, looking at low levels of defects, high levels of productivity. And what they're saying is, in order to get to that could take you between 3 months and 24 months. So I don't think that's 3 months on top of the 2 and 6. I think that 3 months overlaps with the 2 and 6. So the next stage they talked about was optimizing, and this is about market leading pace of change. And if you think about this is not probably as equally about the portfolio management pieces as it is around the Agile team. So basically what this is about is the whole culture of delivering solutions quickly. And if you look at traditional planning methods at the moment, we can take, in the company I'm currently working, you have to decide what's going to be running in the next year. 6 months before the beginning of the financial year. So in other words, the work that's going to be done in month 12 of the financial year was decided 18 months previously. Now, obviously, that means that we've got a very slow cycle going through that pace of change. And what we need to do is to look at, if we're looking at getting that market leading pace of change, we've got to get those ideas into the team and out from the team into production or into use as fast as possible. And that's an end-to-end value stream that we need to look about optimizing, which is why it takes longer, 1 to 5 years, because there is so much change involved. And then the last piece, they're talking about the cutting edge or the bleeding edge of Agile, which is about some of the market research and invention and so on. Now, not all organizations, this is why I said it's not a maturity model, not all organizations are going to want to get to that optimizing piece or that strengthening piece. It will be just enough to get to that delivering responsive to requests. Okay, so if you dig into this model, what you can find is it tells you more about what type of tools and techniques, what types of processes your team could use, what type of behaviors your team could have, and so on. So it gives you guidance for you to start to ask powerful questions when you're in your retrospectives. Okay, so it gives you, and even the focusing, if you've got a brand new team, it gives you some of the ideas about what that team should be working and how the changes should be made, and so on. So it's a really useful toolkit that's behind this. It's worth digging into. And the other place you could go to think about what do I need to do is the Disciplined Agile booklet, which I've mentioned to you previously, called Choose Your Wow, which gives you all those process blades and so on that you may or may not be able to use. How would you run a retrospective? Well, last time we talked about intervention styles, and it's clear that you would probably use a facilitating style in those, taking the team through those 5 steps. So when facilitating, what you're doing is you're not giving training, you're not applying agile wisdom. What you're doing is facilitating a process. So that process then helps the team to deliver the activity. And in this activity, we're talking about the retrospective. So the team will understand what a retrospective is. You'll take them through the data, you'll take them through the ideation type, creation type, brainstorming type actions. You might decide that you're going to dot vote on this, or you might decide some other means of actually prioritizing which pieces we're going to do first. And I think it's fantastic that Joanne's team, decided that product backlog was the thing they wanted to do first. And I think that's great. I think that that possibly means that the evidence that was put in front of them is around that they're not getting proper backlogs. The backlog's not refined enough. Maybe it's too big. Maybe the stories are not detailed enough, or whatever. Or maybe the acceptance criteria are missing. Could be any of those things. So that facilitating style is something that you would use in this type of situation. Okay, and then you would allow the team to think about you in that creating of alternatives. They might come up with some systemic issues, and they might come up with some constraints that they've got to work within. So when you're trying to enable those sort of teams, you're going to have to keep them grounded in reality, which is the R of the goal model, grow model. Okay, so so you might want to look at this as an approach. I would really love to hear from you if you're going to try this, and if you want some more support, then ping me and tell me, and I'll do what I can. But I really do think that there is a lot that we can do to improve our retrospectives and thereby improve the quality and effectiveness of our teams. Okay, remember, I think it was the last session when I talked to you about Al Shalloway's pick up sticks concept. What pick up sticks is about is picking the sticks that are on the top of the pile first before you try and pick up the more difficult ones further down the pile. So it's very important to get the team to start to get quick wins. We all know about low-hanging fruit. Get those, use that sort of the approach in order to try and, somebody said to me, boil the ocean today. So we don't want to boil the ocean, but give them some quick wins. And once they start to get into that winning habit, then obviously what you can do is you can start to tackle the more serious problems. But pick up the sticks model is I think one of the most useful frames of mind for an agile coach, because it keeps you in that narrow and deep channel about making sure that you get something that you can put on the evidence board to say this is what we've achieved this month. Okay, so that's the end of the presentation. I'll just break out of that. I've been working with a couple of people on a new approach to Agile as opposed to sort of Kanban or Scrum, and we've got something called the Agile Lineouts concept, and I'd like to introduce that to you perhaps at the next webinar, which is on the 5th of May. We're going to talk about, this is IT Agile and non-IT Agile, equally applicable. And instead of the circle and loops, what we've got is a line out of teams. What I realized is when you're looking at a Scrum team, there's three things that are happening simultaneously. The first thing is that we're developing a product. And if you look at the product backlog review, and if you look at the daily Scrum, and if you look at the sprint review and the sprint planning, all of those things are really product orientated. Okay, you've got then the ways of working, you know, test driven requirements, TBDD, pair programming, automated testing, all of those things. There's a production or a delivery thread that runs through a Scrum team, and they have to make decisions on that. So I've got a product line and I've got a delivery line. The thing that binds those two together are the behaviors and the team behaviors. So you've got some team behavior, you know, building, you've got things like social contracting, you've got things like ways of working, you've got roles and responsibilities. All of those things need to be decided in the team. So this line out model is using those three concepts and saying, okay, instead of thinking at a, you know, in a single repetitive loop, can we get an incremental step change based on the context? In a rugby game, and you can possibly tell I'm a rugby fan, in a rugby game, the team is, if they have a line out when the ball goes outside of the field of play, the team that is defending, if you're defending a line out, you have strategies, plans, and you've rehearsed defensive approaches. If you go into the middle of the field, the line out operates differently. There's lots of different options that they can have. They've practiced, they've got strategies, they've got different techniques. If you're attacking and you're very close to the try line, the line out team that's attacking has got a range of options, and it could decide to create what they call a rolling maul, or it could decide to throw the ball over the top, or it could do a fancy move that they've rehearsed. So what I'm saying to you is a line out is context specific. So what I'm saying is when you have got a team that's, you know, first or second sprint, the context of coaching that team is different to if that team is in the 10th or 12th sprint. So what we've tried to do is to start to look at how can we get continual improvement through this new way of working. So rather than getting loops which are associated with Scrum, what we're looking at is steps of change and increasing capabilities and so on. So I want to talk to you, that will be the next one on the 5th of May. The other thing we mentioned, and somebody mentioned it on the call at the beginning, we've got a 14-week training session which is going to be about coaching coaches, developing agile coaches. It's been very, very successfully run, and it's based on my Agile Coaches cookbook, and it's going to start on the 13th of May, and we're going to run it for a couple of hours. Basically what it is a couple of hours a week for 14 weeks. So you've got and then you've got a couple of hours of maybe an hour of self-study, and then you've got some practical action. So in total you've got about 4 days of theory and 4 days of self-study, and you've got the practical actions, and there's a discount code there for you as well. So that's just so you got what we're doing.